All right, everyone, thank you for joining. We'll get started in just a couple minutes shortly. I just wanted to give a brief introduction. My name is Lauren King. I work for University of Idaho in the Benoit County office, so up in North Idaho. My colleague and I, Eric Winford, have decided to put on this monthly webinar for restoration practices and different projects that are ongoing and just overall restoration techniques and different case studies. This month, we are fortunate enough to have Ryan Walker with us from Idaho Department of Fish and Game. He's a regional wildlife biologist out of the Tex Creek Wildlife Management Area, and he's going to talk about some different restoration techniques with rhizomatous grasses. Next month, I will be talking about selecting different species for restoration and some fall planting for native plants. So we hope to see you next month as well. But as long as Ryan is ready to go, we can go ahead and get started. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or raise your hand, and I will we'll be able to get to them as we go.
Okay. Thanks, Lauren. I'm excited to kind of get to share some of this stuff with you guys. This is a lot of what consumes a fair amount of my time at Tex Creek, and it's always interesting I find it interesting to talk about and learn from each other and try and figure out how best to work on some of these projects. So with that, let's see if my computer will work. There we go. So I wanted to give you a brief outline because in my head, this all flows together really well. But I also feel like you end up in a bunch of different places with a bunch of different things to consider. So I wanted to kind of briefly talk about, just kind of introduce some of the rhizomatous grass issues, talk about the grasses themselves a little bit and some of the things that we've seen, talk about a CRP conversion study that my predecessor undertook, that I kind of came in at the tail end of and continue to kind of move forward. And then just things that we've learned over the years, things that we've tried over the years at Tex Creek that move us more toward restoration than just a conversion. And I feel like those are like, converting out of existing CRP, like you can convert it and get some benefits, or you can try and restore it. And in my mind, those are two different things, with restoration being significantly heavier. So like kind of setting the scene for rhizomatous grasses, like what do you do with a landscape like this? So this is what Tex Creek looked like back in the 1970s before it became a wildlife management area. Like they farmed to the edge of the road, they farmed to the edge of the creek. It was nothing but bare ground as they were raising, trying to grow winter wheat and things of that nature. And so if you want to protect this, if a program like CRP comes in, and the focus is soil stabilization, which that was the initial goal with CRP, was soil stabilization. So you need something that's going to have a root system strong enough to stabilize soils. You want something that's going to be easy to grow, that's going to grow in a variety of conditions, that's inexpensive because you've got a lot of acres to put seed into. And then if you can provide some forage value for wildlife, then spectacular, and away we go. And so initially, a lot of those rhizomatous grasses were the answer, because they kind of checked all of those boxes. The problem is they fit the bill for some of those, but as CRP has changed and as we've made some realizations about some of these grasses, I feel like that we've realized that those rhizomatous grasses fall short. And so the two primary grasses that we deal with are smooth brome, intermediate wheatgrass. Uh, Interestingly, the smooth brome plant fact sheet through NRCS now actually says that it's pretty invasive and kind of tries to steer people away from it. Whereas intermediate wheatgrass seems to be less invasive. Although I think it's a little bit. It seems to be, to me, it doesn't spread out from our fields quite as much. So maybe it is therefore less invasive, but it is significantly harder to kill. And so smooth brome you can kill pretty easily, and get I feel like get pretty decent control of it pretty easily. Intermediate wheatgrass is a bear and requires some more effort. I'll get into those a little bit more. Both of these species do continue to be recommended and planted across North America. Um, we're actually trying to publish some of this smooth brome work, and there's a number of articles about, removing smooth brome and replacing smooth brome. And you do a search for, converting intermediate wheatgrass back into natives, and all you get is, information about forage production and productivity from an agricultural standpoint. Like nobody seems to be trying to kill this stuff too much. And like I said, both have escaped fields and have spread throughout across the landscape. And so that's one thing to keep in mind as we move along is they've basically naturalized themselves into situations where we can't get them out. We've got aspen stands that have just nothing but a smooth brome understory. We've got hillsides that have been taken over by smooth brome and intermediate wheatgrass. Um, and so that kind of sets the stage for how far we can actually take some things. And then I think the biggest thing is there was a fairly sizable forage quality component to both of these grasses. Everybody thought like, oh, they're great for elk. They're great for cows. They're great for elk. They're great for wildlife. And the wildlife benefits we're finding are I'm going to say are actually pretty minimal. Like they do eat the stuff. At a place like Tex Creek, where we get 2 or 3 foot of snow on some of these fields in the wintertime, like it doesn't have the rigidity to stand up and really be super beneficial. So for those that aren't familiar, Tex Creek Wildlife Management Area is about a 42,000 acre WMA in eastern Idaho, about 15 miles east of Idaho Falls. It's a mix of fish and game lands, BLM, and Bureau of Reclamation lands. It's grown over the years. It was originally formed in 1976 for the creation of Ryrie Reservoir as mitigation for loss of winter range for mule deer and elk. It was expanded in the early 80s after the failure of the Teton Dam. And then we've progressively, as we've had opportunities over the years, fishing game and BLM have added to the WMA. And so across that 42,000 acres, we've got about 10,000 acres of existing fields. A lot of this country was homesteaded and put into CRP when CRP first came out, because soils are pretty unstable, and slopes dictated that they needed something to hold stuff in place. From that previous photo, like you kind of get a feeling for what was farmed out there. And so everything kind of in pinkish purple color on the map there, that's the extent of the field footprints across the WMA. And a lot of those fields were put into rhizomatous grasses, so either smooth brome or intermediate wheatgrass. We do have a little bit of crested wheatgrass, but it's not as significant as the other two. And so the WMA, we kind of run, have a couple of different management management priorities for the WMA. Those being winter range for deer and elk, and then year-round habitat for Columbian sharp-tailed grouse. It's one of the key landscapes for sharp-tails left in eastern Idaho. Um, you know, eastern Idaho has about half of the remaining sharp-tail range left in the country. And to give you an idea on density, so the elk picture was actually taken on Tex Creek after the 2016 fire. We were feeding elk, and so it kind of gives you an idea. We winter about somewhere between 4,000 4,500 elk on the WMA most winters. We're after the fire and a couple of bad winters, we're 1,500-ish mule deer probably, and then a solid sharp-tail population, although we don't have any kind of population estimates. And so these are kind of our three primary upland drivers that kind of dictate what we do, what we try to do, and what we take into consideration as we move forward with some of these management practices. So in 2012, my predecessor was looking at trying to better understand field conversion efficiency and cost to benefit ratios of different treatment types. And so he started this rhizomatous grass conversion study. And so we went around and put 21-acre plots in a field of smooth brome and intermediate wheatgrass. They burned the majority of the field initially, and then came in and applied the various treatments. And so you can see the plots laid out there, and then subsequently measured them through the years. The main I think the main takeaway or main thing to keep in mind is, like, we've got a 1-acre plot here, so it's not a huge field footprint. Fields are planted at a little over 10 pounds of PLS per acre, which is kind of the NRCS recommendation. I think 10 to 12 is what we get based on our location and precip. We're running probably in that field, we're probably running 14 inches of precip a year. And so you can see the mix here. We've got 4 grasses that make up about a little over 50% of the mix that was planted, and then 6 forbs that were the remaining 50%. And then went through and measured stuff with Daubenmeier frames over the years to look at percent cover and whatnot. And then it was mixed additionally with 6 pounds of rice hulls, just to hopefully prevent bridging or any of those kinds of issues in the drill. And these species, for the most part, are fairly standard mix, fairly standard recommended mix for any kind of CRP planting that we're involved with. So Idaho Fish and Game maintains 3 NRCS kind of CRP partner biologists. So they're solely funded through us, but we work with local NRCS offices to make recommendations to landowners during CRP plantings and things of that nature. And so this is a fairly standardish mix for what was used at the time, and kind of still what continues to be used. And so the bottom line, I'll show a couple of I'll point out a couple things as we get further into stuff. But the bottom line was heavier manipulations led to less rhizomatous grass after 2 or 3 seasons. And so those heavier manipulations, the manipulations went from like a single chem fallow, a single Roundup treatment, to all the way to like Roundup, plow it, spray it again, disc it, and then plant it. And so with those heavier manipulations, we saw less rhizomatous grass, but we also saw lower forb densities. And so the lighter manipulations actually led to higher forb densities, a higher forb response after 2 or 3 years. And so, you know, kind of keeping goals in mind on what you're trying to do. And so that was nice to kind of look at a 2 or 3 year event. But as we continued on, you know, I started asking questions of along the lines of like, how fast do we transition back to rhizomatous monocultures? Because if the transition is slow, well, then that can maybe mean that you put less into it up front, versus if the transition is fast, you need to make sure you get all of these rhizomatous species out. And so we continued looking at these plots, um, and continued to collect data. And lo and behold, after 11 years, ground disturbing treatments were all significant. So all of these charts are going to have the same color pattern. The controls are in blue, and then everything that transitions from a lighter color to a darker color means the treatment gets heavier as you go. So, you know, treatment A is a chem fallow, and then with B, C, D, and E, you get varying degrees of disking, of spraying and disking, and ultimately for treatment E, you get a moldboard plow dropped in the ground. And so dropping a plow in the ground after 11 years still resulted in less grass, less rhizomatous grass across that field, across those plots. Is 13%, is a 13.5% increase significant enough? I think we've got a few caveats with that, where I'm not gonna, I don't really want to qualify or stick to like that's a significant enough increase to do more or whatnot at this point. But regardless, there was a 13% increase over that time span. Additionally, you know, forbs are important. Forbs are typically more important for most of the wildlife species. They key in on them a little bit more. Sharptails require do better under a heavier forb canopy, because ultimately it results in a higher diversity of plants, which results in a higher diversity of bugs, which is good for birds. And so looking at how some of the forb canopy stuff changed over that time, you can see we had some pretty high canopy covers of forbs in the first 3 years, and then things gradually dwindled down. But the chem fallow treatment resulted in the highest forb density across the entire time span. And so if forbs are the goal, so now you have to kind of balance this. If forbs are the goal, but you also have to kill grass, like how do you kind of meld these two goals together a little bit? And I think in a standard conversion scenario where you're trying to minimize inputs, like it gets a little tricky, you know, and a lot of this comes down to the species of rhizomatous grass. And so for you know, for getting rid of smooth brome, it seems like you can actually pretty effectively chem fallow it. You can go spray it for 2 seasons and keep it dead, and it'll, you know, seeds will germinate and resprout, and you can get pretty decent control. Grand Teton National Park has done a pretty good job of um, sustaining rhizomatous grass control just by chem fallowing, because they're not allowed to break the ground. Whereas intermediate wheatgrass, we have examples on private ground out by the WMA where they chem fallowed when they went back into CRP, and after like 3 years, you can't tell. It's all intermediate wheatgrass again. And so it's figuring out this balance on this, you know, if you're trying to convert. And then additionally, we wanted to look at which desirable species are out competed first, and which ones might be resilient. So we had six had 6 forb species in the mix. Alfalfa and blue flax certainly responded better across the 11-year time span. Everything did fairly well in the first 3 years, and then continued for these 2 species. Alfalfa has definitely become naturalized across the area, across the WMA as a whole. And so there's always the chance that there was some additional alfalfa on the landscape that didn't get planted. Looking at sainfoin and small brunette, which are 2 species that we rely upon pretty heavily in our current mixes, seemed like they held strong for the first couple of years and then almost tapered out to almost nothing by 11 years. In 23 we didn't actually hit a small brunette on any of the plots. I do remember like seeing it in a plot and being like, one survived. And so it's interesting to look at some of these species differences, and then things like yellow sweet clover and yarrow. Yellow sweet clover is supposed to die out anyway. It's a biennial. It's there for the initial growth spurt, and then it's supposed to dwindle. The yarrow and then the yarrow, for whatever reason, just never really seemed to do a whole lot, which for those that have planted heavy levels of yarrow before, it can get to be a little much. We try and throw some in, but not go too heavy with it, and it doesn't have the same kind of benefit that some of these other forbs typically have. So another way to kind of look at this that I think was interesting as we were working on this subsequent analysis is kind of looking at these plant community comparisons, and this was done by Mitch Parsons, who's the biometrician in the Idaho Falls office here with me, and so he looked at these things, and you can see some distinct separation at 3 years across these treatments. But then by 11 years, like everything really starts to come together. Yeah, the heaviest treatment is still kind of out there on its own a little bit, but for the most part, these treatments are kind of all merging, which suggests that maybe just doing a straight a simple conversion, might not always be the best road forward, depending on what your goals are. And I think I think it's important to have a clear vision for what you're hoping when you're trying to remove rhizomatous grasses from the landscape. And so just to cover a couple of considerations that I think that are just noteworthy here for the study in general. So we did have some differences in planting timing, and we typically plant in the spring at Texas Creek because we have had fall seeding failures just due to timing and soil crusting and other issues like that. And so this study was a mixed bag. There were some fall plantings, there were some spring plantings, and so there might have been some failure across plots. There's always the potential for seeding failures. And then I'm going to call it a relatively low seeding rate. I know it's the kind of the NRCS recommended rate based on a lot of the existing seed calculation spreadsheets and things of that nature. But 10, 11 pounds to the acre has been, I consider that to be a low seeding rate. And I get that it's done to keep costs down and try and be efficient with things, but it's definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration. I think 1 acre plots, they have a high perimeter to area ratio, and so that might increase that reinvasion rate. So we're looking at trying to tease some of this kind of information out from known plantings that we've got, where we've got a 90-acre field and the whole thing was done. Well, how fast has smooth brome and intermediate wheatgrass reinvaded those fields? And then there's always the potential, because so none of these treatment plots were permanently marked, and so there's always the potential that there's some relocation error in follow-up years. It was pretty clear when we were in the plots that were plowed, because we had always have a leading edge low spot for where that mold or plow sits in the ground, but the rest of them, like, you couldn't just tell just because you were on site. And so just to kind of go through some kind of key takeaways, seems pretty apparent that rhizomatous grasses are going to reinvade from year 3 to year 11, and I think some of that's going to be species dependent, but we definitely saw both rhizomatous grasses, both species, still in those plots, across all those years. Let's say treatment is heavily goal driven. You can, if you have a goal of making more food for elk, and that's just your goal, maybe we don't need to get rid of rhizomatous grasses nearly as much. Are you just trying to boost plant diversity? Are you, what species are driving the project in general? And then, because there's variability, because again, these species, both of these rhizomatous grasses, we're never going to get rid of them from the landscape entirely. And so are there ways to work with them that don't require as heavy a treatment, but you still get your outcomes. And that's where a lot of the wildlife considerations come into, and I'll go through a couple examples and just kind of how we think through some of that kind of stuff as we look at different fields. One big takeaway from the study in general that I didn't throw up any data for, but it was pretty apparent, like, you don't really have to sweat the annual weeds, the tumble mustards and things of that sort. Even some of the musk thistle, like, I know musk thistle gets bad in places, and you don't want it to get too bad, but the tumble mustard, certainly, like, you'll see it. The first year of the planting, it'll look terrible, and you'll think everything's wrong. But it'll fade out through time. And then I think a big one is that the type of rhizomatous grass really drives the treatment. So, like I said, it seems that you can pretty effectively chem fallow smooth brome if it's just smooth brome, and dealing with smooth brome seems to be significantly easier than dealing with intermediate wheatgrass. The intermediate wheatgrass, it seems like you have to put a plow in the ground. You have to flip that. You have to flip that sod mat. You have to kill the rhizomes. You have to bury seed. You have to do all of this additional work, or it will come back to haunt you. And it also doesn't. It grows a little bit more diffuse um, than smooth brome does, and so I think follow-up treatments are a little bit trickier with intermediate wheatgrass. Smooth brome seems to stay in these nice tight clumps that you could just go back and maybe hit with a backpack or hit with an ATV sprayer and reseed over the top of. So getting into some of the wildlife considerations, and hopefully I'm not going too fast. I think for my slide count, I think I'm doing pretty good here, but we'll get into some more of these considerations here. So we've got 10,000 acres of fields at the WMA, and they all sit in different places on the landscape. They all have different uses by different species. And so as we look at taking wildlife into consideration, like, how heavily is this field used by elk? How heavily is this field used by sharptails? How heavily is this field used by mule deer? Is the field used by sharptails at all? Is it used, do we have moose? Do we have all of these other, where does it sit in relation to timber and security cover for some of these bigger animals? Where does it sit in relation to winter habitat for sharptails? Where does it sit in relation to timber for pollinators? All of these kinds of things can kind of play into this mix and these considerations. And so on the WMA proper. So this is just uh, a shot of kind of the main portion of the Indian Fork drainage in Tex Creek. And if in the field in the area that's kind of circled in yellow there, like our primary species focus is sharp-tailed grouse because they're a little bit, we can build a field for elk that sharp-tails won't use, but we can build a field for sharp-tails that elk will still use. And so in places, higher places where we know we have lekking birds, we know we have nesting and brood rearing birds, we will that they will be the primary focus, and then elk will be secondary. Versus a field like down here in the bottom, rarely will you see a sharp tail down in these fields. You'll see heavy use by elk in the winter, and maybe some use by deer during migratory periods. And so, you know, differences in these two goals, when you're dealing with when the primary driver is elk, and you don't really have sharp tail considerations, it's about maximizing forage production and forage quality. And so the field that's circled actually is where we fed elk um, after the fire. We fed elk on the WMA to keep them on the WMA so they didn't wander and get themselves into trouble. And so this field we came in after the fact. It was straight smooth brome. We fed elk in it. It was covered in tracks and just beat up. So we disked it and just put a pretty forb heavy mix in. And so this field has smooth brome and sainfoin, alfalfa, small brunette, all kinds of things. 8 years, 9 years later, it still has a lot of those species in it, and the elk eat it to the dirt every single winter. Whereas these fields where our primary focus is sharp-tailed grouse, we've seen some areas where like these fields get too heavy in alfalfa, and it's hard for birds to move around. It's hard for people to walk in. And so you don't have any opening in the understory that that sharp-tail chicks are going to need. And so we've actually taken alfalfa out of mixes and gone heavier on sainfoin because sainfoin grows up off the ground a little bit better. And then we've just continued to diversify mixes and continued to play with things. So as we move away from just a kind of a conversion and move towards a restoration goal, I think some of the things that we've learned through work on the WMA, but also work with BLM on some similar properties, going heavier in the treatment to get as much control as possible for a couple of years seems to do well. And so if you can actually put this ground back into production, it can actually help. And you can do it in a couple of different ways. So you can literally put it back into ag production. We share crop things out. BLM is share crop fields out, and the farmer's responsible for breaking it out. The farmer's responsible for spray and doing everything, maintaining the crop, doing everything that they need to do, and they do that for a couple of years. The field in the picture there, we share crop that for 6 years, and you know, it was pretty good. We just replanted that field this last spring. It came up really well, and we don't seem to have a lot of rhizomatous grasses left in that field. Additionally, if you're not worried about it from a production standpoint, you can put it into a cover crop. And so some of the smaller fields that we can manipulate on our own on the WMA, instead of putting it into winter wheat, we put it into a variety of cover crops that elk seem to really enjoy and birds seem to use readily as well. And so we'll do that for a couple of years, rebuilding some soil fertility and things of that nature. The biggest thing with going heavier with putting it back into production, moving towards that restoration end goal, seems to be dealing with the perennial weeds. And the biggest one that we have issues with is Canada thistle. And so making sure that you're getting control of that Canada thistle before you do the final planting, because in the field on the screen now, we've got some places that we didn't get control of Canada thistle. And so now we have to go back and we have to, not only we have to spray out the Canada thistle, but we've got to be so aggressive to get rid of the Canada thistle, we're probably going to kill everything else that we planted. And so we have to go back in and reseed, which takes additional time, additional money, all of those sorts of things. So if you can spend some additional time up front, it seems to be beneficial. Additionally, going heavier in seeding. So as I've mentioned a few times, that 10 to 12 pounds per acre for our landscape seems to be pretty light. And so we're actually or tripling the seed rate. And so I think most of the time now we're landing about 26, 28 pounds to the acre of pure live seed. So we're almost 3 times what we did in that CRP conversion study. And we still have bare ground. We still have open spaces. We still have inner spaces to go in and plant shrubs or do whatever. And then, like I mentioned with the taking alfalfa out with in areas that we kind of have a sharp tail focus, is selecting plants based on wildlife use. So elk and deer will kind of eat just about anything out there in our seeding mixes forward wise. But how do those, are there some structural differences with some of those plants that lead to differences in wildlife use? And then again, things just kind of vary based on your goals. If you're trying to maximize forage production for elk and you don't really have any other considerations, like you can go super forb heavy, you can go super heavy on the seeding rate and still get those benefits. Ultimately, I think something like that's not necessarily moving towards a restoration end goal, but we still do throw native bunch grasses in those mixes to get that grass component on the landscape as well. We've also started incorporating annuals, and we've been a little slower on incorporating shrubs, but the annuals have been a pretty big deal. So we're throwing in Rocky Mountain bee plant and a variety of different annual forbs or annual sunflowers. The first year we did it, we had a big headed sunflower, and we had like 12-inch heads on sunflowers. We're like, well, what are we going to do with this stuff next year? And we came back in the spring and the elk had eaten all of it. Like they'd eaten the sunflower stalks down to within like inches of the ground. And so what a lot of these annuals do is it adds competition to the mix. So then they're to the field. So what we've seen is, and Derek Tilley has stressed this a bunch in a variety of papers, is like, if you add annuals into your mixes, you don't end up with as much prickly lettuce and a bunch of this other stuff that is going to come up anyway because they're annual weeds. And so it adds some competition to that. So you end up with less to deal with from a weed standpoint. It diversifies the mix. You get obvious pollinator benefits out of it if you're throwing a bunch of annual forbs in there. And then as you get into adding shrubs to a mix, you get into a situation where it'll actually help hold some additional snow on that field in those places, which ultimately gives you more moisture penetration in the springtime. And so as we kind of trickle down, I'm hoping that there's some questions. But just to kind of wrap up a little bit, I think it's important to sit down and think through and why you're doing what you're doing and what the best objective is, and having very clear species driven objectives. Again, if it's to go full on restoration, and remove those rhizomatous grasses completely, get a variety of shrubs on the landscape, and try and move it back to a more native kind of setting. That's different than if you're trying to maximize forage for elk, and trying to keep elk on that landscape. But it's also different than if you're just trying to convert, trying to improve a CRP stand on private ground for the next 10 years kind of situation. The field in the picture right here is one that we worked on. This is probably that field's probably 5-6 years old now. And I took this picture last year, and so it's a drier site, but you still got good production. You still got a bunch of bare ground, and a bunch of places that you can go in and add shrubs and things of that kind of thing, of that kind of nature. If restoration is the goal, I would stress to spend as much time up front as you think necessary to get that clean, to get it clean of rhizomatous grasses, but also to get it clean of rhizomatous weeds. And so things like I mentioned, things like Canada thistle, like get a handle on all of the as many of the problems beforehand as possible. And then be open to all options. So what I mean by that is restoration is a wonderful end goal, but can that old field be more useful as a forb heavy field for feeding elk versus just a full restoration. And so restoration is a phenomenal goal, but if it doesn't fit the needs, and we've got some situations where it doesn't fit the needs, our needs on the WMA, and so we've kind of incorporated those different objectives, and we try and be open to new things, and then ultimately just being patient with the process. This stuff is obviously heavily weather dependent. We've gotten lucky with a lot of our seedings. I've got guys in the field, usually starting about the second week of April, that are starting to put seed in the ground super early. As soon as we can get in and not gum up the tractors with mud, we're in there. But sometimes those seedings still fail, and so we've had fields that we've planted 2 or 3 times because they just continue to be problematic. And then you look at it the first year and you're like, man, that field doesn't look very good. I think we should go plant it again. It's like, well, let's give it another year and see what it looks like. And so being patient with the whole process, I think is pretty important. And kind of trying to take more of a long-term vision of the whole process. So with that, if anybody's got questions, there's my email, and that's the direct line to my office phone. If anybody's curious, wants to discuss things more, I am by no means, I do not consider myself an expert in this. This is work that a lot of people participate in and help with, and I just happen to be the one that got roped into talking to you today. So I'm always interested to hear how things are going other places and learning from other people. So feel free to reach out if anything comes to mind, or you've got questions, you want to see the site, anything of that nature, I'm all for. So
Thanks, Ryan. There was a couple questions in the chat box if you're open to answering them. I can read them out for you.
Let's see. Let's start.
You can look at them, whatever works best for you.
Yeah, let's start at the top here. So looking at Paul. So yeah, so Paul, to your question about cheatgrass, I guess so. what we've typically seen at Tex Creek is we have seen cheatgrass come into some of these fields. They don't tend to dominate. I think based on the amount of precip that we've got on the WMA in most of these places, a lot of these other plants can outcompete it. And so what we're actually looking at doing, what we've been looking at doing over the past couple of years is finding fields that might be a little heavier in cheatgrass than we want, and going in now that we have perennials established, going in with like with a rejuva treatment and knocking that cheatgrass down, and then following up with forbs or with additional forbs if we need it down the road, or putting some shrubs, putting some plugs in the ground, some sagebrush or mixed mountain brush, and actually digging through that that preventative barrier that rejuva forms in the top of the soil. And then we are not, as you point out in the chat, a bunch of the forbs in our mix are not native, but they do really well, and ultimately, we're trying to provide forage for wildlife. We're still trying to stabilize soils, and the reality of the game is native seed is super expensive, and we continue to add natives into the mix. So our current mixes, we typically will have, instead of 10 species, we're probably closer to 20 species, and we're throwing little bits of native seed in, but where we're doubling and tripling seeding rates. That also just blows costs out of the water, and we're trying to be effective. We're trying to be efficient. And when we're already at seed costs of $150, $200 an acre, because we're planting at 25, 30 pounds to the acre, it gets harder to put natives back on that landscape. And we have probably been more forb driven in our seed mixes than what you would see in a native site for the most part. A lot of the native mixes, I know, like we went, the former tech and I went and visited Grand Teton National Park, and they had to collect all their own seed. They didn't have the option to buy seed, and so they were going super grass heavy. And then, I mean, to the point of like they had like 4% forb mix, or 4% forbs in their mixes. And so it's all a balance. But ultimately, we're not necessarily trying to we're trying to be as native as we can, while taking a lot of other stuff into consideration there.
Can you see the Q&A box, Ryan?
Let me pull that up too.
I can read them if
I've got it pulled up. So let's see. Rainy Islands. So to Barbara's question here about basically utilizing undisturbed sites to get a better idea of species distributions. We do have a significant amount of unfarmed lands that are adjacent to a lot of these fields, and we can use that to get to a species composition that might be a little bit more historic. The issue is if it's a shallow enough slope, if we just hit a patch of ground that was too rocky for them to drag a plow through historically, but it's a shallow enough slope, a lot of that stuff has been invaded by rhizomatous grasses. They've escaped those fields and just spread from there. Additionally, we've got we've got some other things like mule's ear or other native plants that tend to not be as beneficial from a wildlife standpoint. And so um, we don't focus on those quite as much, but we do try and incorporate a lot more of the browse friendly plants. So we're throwing arrowleaf balsam root in, and we're throwing penstemons, and we're throwing a lot of as many natives as we can. Again, considering um, considering costs ultimately, because we're doing, it's one thing to do, if we were doing 10 acres at a time or 20 acres at a time, like we could justify spending more money. But the one field um, where we've got Canada thistle some small Canada thistle problems now after it going into production for 6 years, like that's a 300-acre field. It's $60,000 worth of seed at $200 an acre. And so things get out of hand pretty quickly when you're dealing with some of the bigger acreages that we're doing. Um, so maybe Carol can clarify her question as far as um, spraying chemicals and birds. Is it specifically, or so I guess so when we're spraying chemicals, we're spraying Roundup to kill the grasses, and if we a lot of that work is being done in June once kind of birds um, are are hopefully getting closer to be off nests, but also we don't see a lot of birds that are actually nesting or using these rhizomatous monocultures very much. And so it's never, I guess if there is a short term a short term effect in bird disturbance, or nest loss or something along those lines, it's that short-term loss is outweighed by the long-term gain of having more diversity, more higher bug production over the years, all of those things once we get that field converted.
Would also add on to that, you're spraying herbicides which are meant to attack plants, and they're not going after animals.
Yes.
Not like the old school days. You're not spraying DDT on anything, so it's not going after. You're spraying licensed certified herbicides that are going after specific plants. They're not going to be they're not going to be affecting animals. And they dry relatively quickly, and it shouldn't be affecting them overall.
And then looking at Doug's question here, understanding the original native plant communities strategies. I think having a handle on what those native plant communities look like can certainly help for strategies for restoration. I think the two problems that I see, at least in the stuff that we're doing, I don't know how much, and this may not sit well with some people. I don't know how much I trust reference sites, because it's hard to find something that hasn't been manipulated by us in some way, shape, or form. And so it's, from a species composition standpoint, okay, maybe it hasn't been tilled, but did it have sheep run on it for 40 years? And that species composition is now different than historical things of that nature. But then also just, for my consideration at the WMA, where we're trying to balance benefits to hold elk on the WMA, or to get mule deer through a winter, or to raise more sharptails to keep things on the ground, is, again, we try and balance what was native and what's there versus what's efficient and functional on that landscape. As we do transition, so one thing that we've been doing, as we transition um, back more to a restoration standpoint. Yeah, I primarily talked about the grass and the forb component today, and that's a lot of the initial work that we do. And then once we get a field to a situation where we're pretty sure it's gonna stay put and it's not gonna change dramatically, it's not gonna turn weedy on us, or we're not gonna have other issues, we will start adding a lot of those native shrubs back in. And so we've started adding a lot of mixed mountain brush back into a lot of these sites, or adding mixed mountain brush into places that we can't work, because there are definitely locations that you could plow with a dozer, which most of this country was busted out with a dozer, that my farmer will not drag a mold or plow through, and he will not let anybody drag a mold or plow through, because he says you're gonna roll the tractor. And so we've got some of those kind of edge places where we've been going in and adding shrubs back onto the landscape as well, throughout this entire process. It's just I want to be me trying to be as efficient as we can be. I want to make sure that that field is set up and going in the right direction before we throw shrubs in. Because if you for some reason had to go in and plow it because you had a bunch of intermediate wheatgrass come back into that field, plowing through shrubs is just that much harder on equipment. And so I want to try and make sure that we get things steered in the right direction before we get too far down um, too far down that full restoration rabbit hole where we can't where it just ends up being more work in the end.
All right, thank you, Ryan. If you guys have any other further questions, feel free to reach out to one of us and we can get those answered. Otherwise, we appreciate you guys joining us today, and we will be back next month again, and we'll learn about selecting different species for restoration projects. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.